Good, good morning and welcome to our live broadcast for History 232, the Middle East since 1453 to the present. This is our live broadcast today. I know that you can hear me and I know that you can see my screen. We'll start with the Suez crisis here and then transition back and finish with the Iranian revolution and then some comments on what's going on today. Well, but our two goals are the same: update questions and then content presentation, Suez crisis to give a little background on that, and then the Iranian revolution, the loss of the Shah. This happens under Carter's administration, and then the movement toward in our country, the 1984 election with Ronald Reagan, and the continuation of this situation in Iran. We get the release of the hostages, and Iran continues that time forward, really, last 41 years in the current position that she's in. All right, so let's do the updates and then your questions, and then I'll move into the content. We all know everything opens on Monday, closes on Saturday, and I do the grading. I look through, I think, most of the items that you've done on discussion questions and web activities I've taken care of. We've got that. This is week 16, and the big emphasis is on the Iranian Revolution. There's reading, the good reading there for you. Media material and the audios from the BBC are outstanding, so you should listen to those, get into the reading, and also the media clip that I have in there. All right. Final examination questions were out yesterday. The study questions are the examination questions. I opened them yesterday, so you have a week to prepare the three essays. And again, you can use any of the questions that I have for you that I released yesterday. I think there's a couple of groups there. One are my standard questions, and then the others come from the modules. Remember, you need to select three essays, and you can also use takeaways from each one of the collaborate sessions that I've covered. Remember that a week from today, I'll open up the links, so you'll have the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st to upload the three essays and to submit the paper. And so I'll have to go through to make sure that the links are there. Took me, it's quite a while. I'd open up 7 classes yesterday to get all the papers in there so that everything opens correctly so you could find them. So we were doing quite a bit of work on that. So everything got out. I wish I could have done it in the early morning, but that just wasn't going to happen with the classes, the 3 classes and the 4 separate hour-long Zoom meetings for the college that some of us participated in. So to help you along, I opened all the modules up again from the end of the exam right up through module 16, so you'll be able to go and review those. Remember, we're looking at 3 essay questions. These are full essays: an introduction, narrative, and a conclusion and a summary. Some people say, well, what's the difference between a summary and a conclusion? Well, when I talked about in my other classes about the paper, what you're doing is you're summarizing what you've been working on. Okay, like an introduction, you tell everyone this is where I'm going, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm going to prove, this is what I'm going to answer, these are all my documents and things. And then, same way when you write the essay, you say, okay, this is a summary, so I've done what I'm supposed to do to answer this question. Your conclusion is what you think about it. It's like your voice coming through. Oh, really? Yeah, it's a big essays is the thinking process. What do you have to say about what you've been writing about? What did you learn? What do you want to know more about? What can you conclude from studying this? You can say, well, this history is pretty important because since 1453 we're on this track, and I can tell when you turn on the news. Last couple of weeks I was doing American history, my American history on Carter, and so the students yesterday said, well, we've listened to that. 2 weeks ago, you covered how there was an energy crisis, there was inflation, there was turmoil at home, and there was a war in the Middle East. And some of them said, it looks like we've got the same thing today. We've got high inflation out there, and we've got turmoil, and we've got oil problems, and gas is going up, and we've got rockets flying from the Gaza and Hamas and Israel. I said, well, that's the administration. Those are the things that he had to deal with. And it says, like, does it ever change? I said, well, yes and no. But the issues in the Middle East have been going on a long time, and it affects the rest of the world, especially when we're dealing with oil and resources like that. So, pretty interesting. So, in your um, conclusions, is an opportunity for you to say something about those three essays that you've been working on, that it should be pretty relevant to all of this history. All right. So, three essays, and the go ahead, Devin. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's also tied to modernization. You see, the whole question in history and in civilization, does civilization give us progress, or does progress give us civilization? And that's a question that's hard and never really can be answered. And so, what you're seeing here in the Middle East um, is they've moved along a track for a long time that tries to fend off change, and they don't like it, and they're very somewhat insular, loose connections. And when you try to make something more out of it and kind of force them together, and this is the same thing we're seeing in Afghanistan right now, is they're out of there. There's these multiple groups, and they have tribal, well, like warlord leaders, and these people support them. And so it'll take a while before these tribal lords will get together and form how they're gonna operate. And hopefully the Taliban and others will be marginalized. But what it leads to is that the more modernization they have with weapons and things, the greater that the struggle can continue. Before, with the older weapons, it's hard because you got swords and shields, things of that, spears, and the traditional way. That's the same way with the samurai and others. Is that you can do some damage, but not as much as you can with rockets, missiles, poison gas, and all of that. And they're in a much smaller, confined area. So the question is that they fended it off for a long period of time, and then they decided, the Ottomans and others, is that they'll surpass it. So they'll be the leaders in this field. So they tried to jumpstart it. The Chinese did the same thing under the Great Leap Forward and the 5-year plans and all of that. They're trying the same thing today. And so it's not the West that promotes modernization. It's the world. It's just somebody finds something somewhere, then everybody wants to have it, whether it's a phone or a computer or whatever it is. And some folks don't want to do that. And they say, well, something's wrong with you. You got to get rid of that landline. What do you mean you don't have a phone? Look at the special groups here in our country, like the Amish and others. They don't have telephones. They don't have electricity. They just don't want to do that. And generally get along and do what they need to do, and they're close to that. So the idea is what do they want? And you can see the struggle that takes place, and then you have to then figure out why it's there. So when you're talking about some of the essays, question, you're looking at 1453, whatever your question is at the end, as you've explained, Devin, you can kind of give views of it because it's important. Everybody says, well, you got to change, you got to get rid of that. That's old. Well, they don't like hearing that. Yeah. The religion isn't old. Their buildings aren't old. What they believe in isn't old. It's to a lot of people is very relevant. And these buildings, these structures, have a meaning, and they're willing to fight for those, uh, for what they believe in. And so there's nothing wrong with groups of people who don't want to change. It's actually when you force them in, will marginalize you because you can't do these things. So you can argue it either way because it's extant today, and the rockets have been flying back and forth. Right? What a tragedy like that. Okay, so that's what you can do for the essay questions. Good introduction, good narrative, evidence, details, specifics. You got a week to work on them. If you have any questions, let me know. Give a good summary of what you've talked about in the essay, and then give your conclusions to everything. You talk 3 or 4 sentences, nothing major like that. do as much as you need. Make sure it's all double spaced and get everything set up. Your papers, meaning the document study, should refine the content. Make sure you meet the pay allocation. Make sure you selected bibliography and proofread the paper. Because as I go through them, I actually read. I've been, I read two or three more that came in late, not from your class, but from others, because it's important to clean the papers up. So when I get them, it's not like, oh my goodness, look at this. A single space, no numbers on them, blank spaces. I couldn't find anything for this question, and I know we don't have any of that. So proof the paper, you know, put it on spell check, grammar, read it to someone else, read it to yourself, edit it, revise it, be proud of it, put the whole paper together. It's an important part of what you've done. You can polish a lot of these papers up and get to the level where you can submit it to undergraduate journals and magazines, even to the Harper Anthology is one, Phi Alpha Theta, the History Honorary, a lot of ways to get things out. And students say, oh, I can't do that. I've had three or four students publish, especially my English history class. I had them do case studies on these orphans and waifs that were in these schools, and all the documents are there. There's thousands of them, and they're 19th century waifs who were abandoned and taken in by these schools. This is before the government took them over. Their private schools, the Anglican Church, and some of them ended up coming to the United States and doing really well. They were in British military, the U.S. military. They told the whole story, their pictures, their life, and everything. And they said, "Oh well, there was such great stories. That's what they did for the whole semester, their paper." And I said, "Well, let's send it to me. I couldn't publish anything." And sure enough, three of them got picked up right away. Nobody's ever written about these people. They're called it's hidden lives. You could look them up on the web if you want to look at them. There's plenty of those in the history of the Middle East as well that no one ever knows about. All right. So when you're working on the essays, use the material in the books that I have for you. Use the modules. You don't need to go out and do a whole wide web search on all of these things like that. Okay. If you have any questions about anything, send me an email. I'll try to get to them. I had quite a few yesterday, which is good. Everybody's asking questions, and they're on target with a lot of things, and they starting on questions last night, which is good. Remember, next week there's no live broadcast. I'd love to do one, but it's final exam week, and we don't do any classes during final exam week. So I think you'll be in good shape to finish everything up. So you have 3 days to get everything in. Now, if something doesn't work right and you're trying to do it on Friday, not to panic if the whole system shuts down because Blackboard closes, and the college may just, you may not be able to get into it after starting on Saturday or Sunday. And if that happens, the email still works. I mean, email. We don't want any um, anxiety, any problems. If something doesn't work, you can't upload it, just send me an email, and I can probably email it to me, and I can read it and put the marks into the grade book in Blackboard. But it should be okay. Gonna I have an ability to go in and keep it going for a couple of days, but it'll take me a while to do that. So you should be fine. But if something comes up, say, I've already given you that we've got a couple before I have to turn the marks in, so we'll be able to sort out if there's any technical issues that come up. All right, I think then I've covered everything I needed to in the update. I'll turn it over to you. What questions you have to do, anything I can help you with? Okay, questions, comments, anything I can help with at this point? Okay, anything comes up when I start on content for today, just interrupt me, Professor. I'm going to have a question. I'll stop. Be happy to answer it for you. All right. Today, then I'm going to dip back and put in the Suez crisis. I kind of mentioned it, and I thought it would be good for us to talk about that. Me to go over. So one of the takeaways today is the significance of the Suez crisis. What was the outcome of it? What is the crisis? Is there a war? What's going on? Who is involved? What was the outcome? Why is the Suez crisis significant? Gets back into some of the theories that I used for this aspect of things, meaning it's a crisis and conflict. model. And so you start with a crisis, it leads up to certain parts to it, and then you get to a crisis, and eventually two things can happen. Um, the crisis can be, in a sense, put out, or it leads to like hot war. And so the Suez crisis wasn't solved, and wasn't. It kept going up, up, up until it got to a point where it exploded. They couldn't put it out, couldn't settle it, so it exploded into a conflict. So what we see in the Middle East today, a series of crises between borders. It's always borders. People want certain things. It starts maybe in Jerusalem, then moves to Gaza, goes back and forth, and then it leads to well, conflict. All right. So the second part there, I'll go back into the Iranian Revolution and pick up and do the conclusion on that. And then if there's time, some comments on the current situation that's transpired over the last 4 or 5 days. So the other takeaway last time is the significance and impact of the Iranian Revolution with the Shah leaving and the Ayatollah Khomeini coming in the current track that the Iranians are on today. All right, so that's what we'll move to today. Posted in the background is the bombing of Egypt here. Who's doing this? You can see in the background that says allies. What's going on? There's a crisis over the Suez. The Suez is the Suez Canal. So what what's happening here? Okay. Well, in July of 1956, Nasser nationalizes the canal. He takes it over from the British, and the French are also still involved. And you can see French and British raid Cairo and Alexandria. So Eisenhower was elected in 52. He's reelected in 56. So this is during the summer of 56 when the political campaigns are taking place, and the election will be in November of 56, and Eisenhower will be elected and serve until 1960. And so what happens is a war breaks out. Um, and so what are the outcomes of the war? And Nasser takes over the Nasser's heavily tied toward the Soviets, the Russians. We tried just to put something together like we had NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and then we tried with CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and then we tried one with Mediterranean um, Treaty Organization, of which we tried to get Egypt in. It was this Northern Alliance that was taking place after the war, so that build up our influence, and Egypt was an important part of it. However, when Nasser comes in, there seems to be a falling out. So the results of nationalizing the canal, there was a crisis before that, before he takes the action, and the British and the French couldn't deal with it, nor could the Israelis, nor could the U.S. And what does Nasser do? He takes over the canal, and when he does, this is what happens. The outcome is war. And who's involved in the war? Okay, the British, the French, and Israel, right? Why? Because the canal, throughout history, once it's established, is the lifeline for the British and for Europe, and also the Far East, India, and others. And if Egypt takes it over, they nationalize it. They're going to control it. They'll employees. They'll be there. The fees that'll be there. How trade comes through. Who gets priority. What's the rate per cargo, oil versus other kinds of goods. And we've just seen that when one ship gets stalled in the canal because of the sand area. The canal isn't that wide. At certain areas, you have to be careful, and be astute. The ships are bigger, the cargo heavier, things happen. And so Egypt decided that it was theirs and they took it. All right. And when the war breaks out, there's some goals, right? Wow. And those are this: what do the French, the British, and the Israelis want to do here with the Suez crisis? Well, they want to capture the Sinai, secure the canal, and remove Nasser. You say, is this new? No, it's not. I'm going over how the British have been toppling and putting different regimes in at different times. So Comparison is we had that with the Shah, we had Iran and Saudi Arabia, and our presidents coming out of even before World War II believed that the Iranian, Iran, and the Saudis could be as two stabilizing forces in the Middle East to bring everything together uh, after World War II to create an environment of peace and harmony among the peoples that were there. Well, things started to change because the Iranians coming in much more conservative than what was moving. All revolutions usually take place when things are getting better, but not fast enough. If you look at the anatomy of a revolution, Crane Britton published the book, The Anatomy of a Revolution or The Origins of Revolutions. It's all the same. Even in our colonial period, our revolutions take place when things are getting better, but not fast enough. So if things are getting better, you better get them going way out in front because same way things will fall apart if you don't. You'll get into a revolution. Same thing in Russia, 1905, 1917, internally they're at war. Uh, the same thing in China with these different revolutions. And so things were really getting better in Iran, and they were putting together beautiful high-rise housing, public housing, and they were getting into hotels and motels and all of that. And what was happening is sometimes you lose touch with the people because the people throughout their history they were interested in those even during the Ottoman period. The Sultans banned coffee shops and smoking and all that for a while, but then they got back into cigarettes and smoking and got into the coffee shops because they were like dens of iniquity to them. They didn't like hotels and motels, this family life. And so when that was happening in Iran, um, people, there was an undercurrent of what? They didn't like those changes. Right? Same thing in China. Let's build a high rise. Same thing here. We had all that public housing, 24 stories high, whatever it was. Get people in there and everything will be fine. Well, maybe, maybe not. You ever ask people how they like to live? Look through the Middle East. How many high rises do they have? They got a lot in Saudi Arabia and other parts because they're modernizers. But in other areas in Egypt, you go in through the, the areas, you go up and down the Nile and go 10, 15 miles either way. They're not living in 17-story high rises in there. No. And so part of what happens in Iran is this revolution that takes place because yes, things are getting better. They're really modernizing. And you look at the picture, you saw all of Iran dressed up in what we call Western dress, and the leader of China does the same thing. I mean, you look at him. Leader of Russia does the same thing. Well, why is that? Is that progress? But anyway, we see here if we're going to capture the Sinai, and then the people that are Sinai, all these warring factions coming from France, Britain, and Israel, and also from Egypt. They're caught in the middle, just as they are today, and really don't like it. It's like having a war in your backyard. This is our backyard. If you want to fight, go somewhere else. Well, I'm sorry, this is the only way to get through. We got through the neighborhood, and so the battle's going to take place in your backyard. But that's where we live. Well, that's too bad. Move. No, 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 we're not moving. So you see the struggle that takes place here. Very similar to what you see today. So everything's going to start in October of 1956, right before the election with Eisenhower. Um, and 3 days, Israel fought in the north and was very successful. It's an invasion. And what happens is Israel moved into the Sinai. Well, the people in the Sinai really didn't like it, but this is on the way to where we have to go. There's no other way, even though they have air power and they can do paratroopers and all, to move into the Sinai. Okay. And so what Britain and France do. Remember the slide, bomb Egypt? There it is. Britain and France bombed Egypt for 100 hours. Well, it tells you how important the canal is to them. Wow. You believe that? 100 hours, not 24, not 48. Planes coming in, different bases. So got them in that area. France has got them. They're there. And this is what happens when you close off, you try to nationalize the canal. Then what did they do? Well, if you bomb them, it's the same way. So you have an artillery barrage, the artillery barrage starts and the bombing stops, what do? You send in ground troops. Okay. What are they focusing on? The canal. Were they successful? Yes. But then we've got to see the outcome of it. So now ground troops come in. So where are ground troops going? This is we're getting into our election in that Tuesday in November, right close to it. What happens in the world? Paratroopers at the Northern Canal Zone. So what do American newspapers do? Well, they got to cover the who's elected. They got to cover the canal zone. We got reporters over there, like that. So in come paratroopers, French paratroopers. And so for my Far East class, I've been doing a lot on Vietnam and the French, and they make all the French out as just, they're lazy. It's just ridiculous, the inaccuracy of information like this. So on November 5th, on French and British paratroopers, probably the finest paratroopers in the world at this time, even during the war, were French paratroopers. I mean, you can't count the French out. Even, don't get that much coverage in World War II. They're in it, even though they've got Vichy, but always see American paratroopers, and we do. We've got 101st, 82nd Airborne, 101st, our airborne troops. They're the finest, and they are. But you don't ever cut the French out of this. They well prepared, and they send in some of the best ones they have, and down they go. And so now they are doing what? It's like a special forces group. Uh, After the shelling stops, in goes the land troops, and before land troops can get to the northern part of the canal to drop in, uh, their paratroopers. When they drop in their paratroopers, they secure it for what? These are the first people to go in there, like our Marines, the French Marines, the French paratroopers are there. They control the northern part of the canal now, run the Egyptians out. Fighting takes place, and then it's secure radio communications, and so now we can send in British force and French reinforcements. They've seized the northern part of the canal, and if you get the northern part of the canal, then nothing can get through there because the French paratroopers are there, and the British and French land troops, the army comes in. It's a very smooth operation. They're good. They were good in Vietnam as well when they needed to be. Things happen when we get to it's 2 years before 1954 at Dien Bien Phu when the French have to evacuate Vietnam. Another story, but it's the same scenario. These French paratroopers, they didn't collapse after that. Here they are, 1956, and within a matter of not very long, probably less than a few hours, they control the northern part of the Suez Canal, and that's a tough one to do. Fighting goes on until the world's really concerned about it, so we take it to a higher level instead of to the French or the British, and we do that in a secondary nature. Where do we send it? Send it to the UN. And very quickly, right at the time of our election in early November, there's a UN ceasefire. Okay, why? So you got to realize that after World War II, the UN comes in and people have views about it today. It works, it doesn't work. But in reality, it's better than nothing. And it does a lot. And it sometimes doesn't get the credit for that. So a ceasefire. Why is there a ceasefire? Well, there's some specific reasons for that. Well, what are they? The UN worked. How did it work? International pressure. And so what happens, instead of the U.S. sending over troops and having it, serve as an intermediary between the British, the French, and the Israelis poured in there and really came strong. Uh, and for us to negotiate between Egypt and Israel, France, and Britain, we take it to the UN, and other nations have to come up. So I was pretty smart on that. He's as a great leader of our supreme headquarters, allied powers of Europe, and commander of all those allied forces. War is one thing, and it's a hammer to get things done. But then he knows enough to say, if we go in and try to sort this out, and the Soviets will probably come in and back them, and then we'll escalate. So let's take it to the UN, and so the Russians and Chinese, in a sense, they got boxed in on this because it's not just the U.S., it's other countries in the world that are affected by the Suez saying, we just can't have people, leaders of countries getting together and attacking. We just can't have the countries taking over, nationalizing certain things. It'd be wonderful if some country just nationalized the Mediterranean and say, we control it, don't come in. Same thing China's trying to do with East China Sea, South China Sea, these areas. This is ours, stay out. And when you nationalize something, uh, you know, countries go to war. The prospects theory of war is this, and it should be taught more: is countries go to war to maintain the status quo. And so, the status quo was we had access to the canal, and Egypt changed it. If they didn't like it, it should have been set up from the very beginning that no foreign power would be involved, but you took something from us. So as China continues to you know, project into the East China Sea, and she starts saying it's mine, and you all have to stay out of there, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, New Zealand, and Australia, no, 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 no. You're going to change the status quo. You can't do that. Certain seas and oceans are open to everyone, and then you have a little territory on your own. So let's not do that. So wars really erupt, and there's a change in the status quo. So what do you mean? Well, something happened in Jerusalem in the last week or so that erupted the status quo, and that got things moving. And so everybody watches as these rockets fire and all these reporters, but nobody gets to the core element is okay, what changed that forced this to happen? It was an incident. And usually, if you return to the status quo of what we had, a lot of these areas, these struggles, these you going from a crisis to a conflict will dissipate. But no one takes the time to do that. Those are what we talk about, what we teach about. And so here, to get the status quo back, international pressure is applied. And what does it produce? The U.S. pushing behind other countries. The result is this, okay? British and French to leave. So I put the word we compel them. We don't order them. We don't push them. So through the UN, we this to happen. So there's others working in tandem with the U.S. So you can lead, but you have to lead up. If we continue to do all that, other countries will sit back and say they'll do it, not to worry about it. It's like group work when you participate. If somebody does all the work, say, okay, they want to do the whole thing, let them do it. I'll just sit back, nod my head, and I'll get my mark. Well, I'll get a good mark, but no, that's not teamwork. You can't rely on the one person all the time because that person may get worn out and not be able to continue, and then you're all lost. So the U.S. pushes, drags, gets them there, and these things happen. All right. So the British and French are leaving, and then what happens? Israel withdrew to the Sinai. Okay. Then what happens? Okay. Well, there's something else is gonna come out of it. November. This is all during the election time. So much for our elections and what the news coverage is. So it goes back to the Sinai. The people in the Sinai are saying, "You're back again." Well, yeah, we'll eventually either go forward into Egypt directly, or we'll go back to uh, our area in Israel. So in late November, then, with the British and French out and the Israelis pulling back, UN peacekeepers come in. Okay, come right in, and their job is to keep the peace. That's what the UN is supposed to do. These peacekeepers come from all different countries, from Holland, Belgium, areas in Africa. These are peacekeepers. Of course, they won't bring any in from Egypt or Britain. Usually, it's Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Baltic countries. Generally, uh, haven't been involved in this struggle. So, what do we want to do then? The UN will help negotiate, and then remember the prospect theory of war, status quo. So we're going to have this crisis, and unfortunately, the crisis goes into conflict, which is a war, and there's a lot of damage done, a lot of fight, a lot of injury, a lot of casualties. What happens is this, okay? Early peacekeepers 1957, they get up into the Sinai. Ah, okay. And then Israel will go back to Israel. And so it takes about a year. And what happens? Egyptian boundaries return to pre war times, which is what? The status quo. However, there's some progress that takes place. And the British and French still today blame Eisenhower for it because they didn't like it, because they wanted some things to happen. I told you what the goals were, and these things didn't happen. And so, what's the outcome? NASA retains power and the canal. Now, the Russians are happy. NASA is happy. Really isn't the, well, he was already there. So, there's no return to the status quo because he never left. They wanted to topple him. Uh, but the change is they don't. The status quo isn't the same because the British and the French boundaries are the same. The status quo, but when it gets to the area of the canal, is that the canal will be um, retained by Egypt, the overlordship of Britain and France, and Israel's comments in support of the British and however, through other economic means and things like that, the French and British, and with their money and resources, still manage to, in a sense, have economic control. But for the all intents and purposes, out of this, it's a win for the Egyptian people because now they believe that they've won in this situation. But winning is the work of the United Nations to make sure that things move on the proper direction. And with a period of time, the war's footing ends. And and that model I gave you about the Middle East 2 weeks ago, the timing was good because now you can see what happens today. This is the continuation of these short wars, and I haven't had an opportunity to look this morning to see what was happening in that part of the world. But if everything moves according to that model that I gave you last time, that within a few days there'll be a ceasefire, and then there'll be more negotiations along the way. But the damage from the um, the environment is there because you have the residue from all of these rockets and things, just not the pieces of them, but the chemicals that are there continue to cause all kinds of turmoil in the water, in the air, and in the ground when you're trying to grow things. So the cleanup is going to be just massive in that. Okay, so that's what I wanted to give on the Suez, the the kind of the overview, the brief outline of it, and there's a lot of depth as to the who's fighting and how the fighting's going, but it gives you, a little bit of a prospect theory of war and our involvement and how things began to shape in the Middle East. Here's some progress. Um, Civilization is there, but the progress is that this is Egypt. This is our canal. All right. So let me move over. I want to conclude what I had for you on Iran, and we're going to do that we're going to get that up here, get that taken care of for everybody because that's an important part of where we left off last time. I got a good start on it, but I want to get that in for you because you may want to write on that as one of the exam questions as to what's been happening. Okay. As we left off, then you can see the Shah, very Western dress, his wife, very Western as well. And that's the image that's there. There's the connection. That's the continuation of what Lemon started with is that, all right, what we need to do is it these cultural changes, these things are coming in, so we'll adapt them, we'll adopt them, and we'll push them forward. So we'll be out ahead. We'll create new things on shopping malls and all of these kinds of things as it's important to them. So this is what the people we thought wanted, and some did. But as people move through different age groups, they they like it, and then you can't condemn people who don't want change like that. It's they don't want a cell phone. That's fine. You don't have to have one. Nothing wrong with that. You can stick to the landline. And so I've already given you a little bit of that, but within a 7 year period, the Shah is out. Okay. He's trying to work with Parliament in passing additional sweeping reforms. That gets back to the theory. Revolutions occur when things are getting better, but not fast enough. It's that last group that really wants it, and you've got to move quickly to get them in because if you don't, you'll lose them. They lost them. And so everyone says, well, this is all of a religious revolt and all these other things. Well, those are all parts of it. But this revolution took place because they couldn't get the changes in fast enough. Once you start them, I mean, it's like a J curve. You know, you make a J and it keeps going up. Well, eventually there's a ceiling. And if you don't raise the ceiling or if you don't cap that J curve, so you flatten it out and it stops going up, when it hits that line, wherever that line is, it'll explode. And it hit here. They couldn't do it. So he was working a very as hard as studious, arduously as he could to get additional sweeping reforms through that touch all of the people that are being um, sort of moved in the other direction, saying these things really aren't good for you. And they said, well, we'd like them to try them first to see what they are, and but they're not getting down to them. Well, they're never going to give them to you because you're down. You see the same thing today. It's like, well, you're never going to get them. Yeah, well, we will. No, you won't. They're never going to come to you. And so now you have to say, well, this is a crisis of belief whether we're going to get these things or not. And finally, they don't think they're going to get them, and that's the end because he can't get them fast enough. That's what's taking place. Now, along with this, the Shah begins to believe that our CIA and our government is working against him, and that's never really been settled yet. And this is all pretty recent, and so those documents were locked up for 50 years and some of them 75 years. So we really don't know. But you need to know that that was being talked about. So here he is. He's working with his parliament. Of course, look at the structure. Now they have a parliament. It's not a tribal council or anything like that. These are the parliament, so they're elections. It's not hereditary based on tribal or clannish groups. You have to go through an election, right? And maybe that's the way to go. Maybe it isn't. Okay. And Shaw believed in his final months the CIA was trying to oust him. And so that's what we don't know. He believed that. And I've read the transcripts. He actually brought in the American ambassadors, representatives, and had a big dinner before them. And afterwards, he pulled them aside after everybody was leaving and say, I really think this has happened. And can you confirm it? And our people said they didn't know anything about it. So um, I can't tell you for sure, but he actually believed that. And so, if that was the case, then something's going on in the Carter administration between 1976 and 1980, because Carter basically abandons the Shah, and then they find out he's sick and he's basically a citizen of the world. No one would take him in. Um, yeah, very very tragic situation. And so, what happens is 1979 forward, after the Shah leaves, the Ayatollah Khomeini comes in, and there's a new governmental structure. But over time, there's this growing opposition to the current ruling regime. And you see that there's been some elections that they've had, but the ruling group um, may or may not have all of the support of the people, especially the younger people. There's quite a large percentage of individuals that are in Iran that are under 30, under 25. And so this opposition uh, begins to grow. And why does it grow? Because once the Shah is toppled and he's gone, then the new ruling class has to come in. And remember, the Shah tried to get certain reforms to the people, but he couldn't get the reforms to the people. Right. So what's going to happen? What do we see? Okay. 70% of the people moved away from the ruling group. Hmm. Why did they do that? Well, they couldn't get the things that they wanted from the previous group. And then when the new group comes in, they're promised certain things, and then very difficult to deliver those. And even today, with the sanctions and things of that nature, very difficult to deliver those because we don't hear a lot of from the people. We only hear from the regime of what they're trying to do in working with uh, the Syrians and Assad, working with Russia, this, the Russian Federation, working with the folks, the Yemen and Saudi Arabia doesn't care for that as well, and now so now you have this struggle that's taking place, and it turns into from time to time from crisis to conflict, and we keep going back and forth between them. Okay, so this is what the revolution promised: social justice, freedom, and democracy. Their words, not mine. In translation, that's what it is. Okay, and so the Shah had a plan of modernization, of progress, and giving individuals more opportunities, all those things for work, jobs, small businesses, education, all that reform, rights, all that. And so when the revolution comes in and the Shah is forced to leave his country, and his family leaves with him as well. I'm not sure where his son is today. The new group that comes in promises social justice, freedom, and democracy. All right. So today, we here we are, you know, May 13th, 2021, and I can report that the people don't have them. Okay, at least that's all the evidence that we have. Without being there personally on the ground, I tell you any more than hmm, yeah. And so there's an undercurrent that's there. And so, whatever regime, whatever structure is unable to fulfill what it wants to do. Everybody thinks we can settle it, we'll do it. And when they get in, find out, it's just not quite, we have other issues. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. Those people that should be there never get elected. And many, they don't get elected. If they run, they won't get elected. To have elections in these areas, they are so diverse, the ballot would be so long, it'd probably take you 4 hours to vote. That's not how they function. They're just like a large family group. Like you have a large, everyone has a large family group. So somebody, in different cultures, they call them like patriarchs, there's a leader. And so that's the person you want. Well, others will come in and get other people to run against that person in an election, and then that person who may be either older or younger, it doesn't matter, decides it's embarrassing for me to run against that person because that that person within our group has always been sort of on the outs and doesn't agree with everything, but goes along with us because this is a family group. So the people they don't like eh, running people. Certain people don't like standing for election to join these ruling groups so that they don't run. That's what's going to happen in Afghanistan. You're going to have they call them warlords today. They're going to come back and try to put their country back together. And they're going to do the same thing in Libya. It's going to take a long time to do that. And so you're not going to see any major changes 20 years, 50 years. We'll all be gone before you see those changes of what they're going to become. It's going to take that long for them to knit themselves back together from each tribal group to start talking to the other tribal groups. So then they form a bigger cluster and finally a smaller provincial area. And finally they build it up to say, okay, this is going to be the main leader over everything. Right now they don't have them. These leaders come in out of exile from all over the place, and the local people are there. and it's a different structure. And so the reason why we don't see the changes is because the people that should run and get elected don't, or because there's other people that come in that say, we've got the power, we're going to back this person, and we'll pay people in this cluster in your family group to vote this way. And so those people then begin to corrupt your group, and because they're going to side with the other side because they get some reward from doing that. That's what goes on. And so everybody meddles. Oh, Anwar Sadat was pretty good, and so was Mubarak, but they got consumed, and Sadat was assassinated, and Mubarak was tragically removed like that and put in a cage. It was terrible. He was an Egyptian. Oh, I was so sad to see that. So sad to see that. And then Sisi comes in out of the military. Um, I could have told him from the beginning that Egypt isn't going to change. It's always been a military state, and that's the way it's going to be. And the leaders of Egypt, it's from the time before Mehmet Ali. It's the same way. It goes back to the great Mamluks army. It goes back to the Ottoman Empire. Egypt will always be a military state, and that's the way it's going to be until the people decide they don't want it. So you just need to ask them. I've had many Egyptian students in class, and we've had good discussions over that. They know a lot about what goes on. The last couple weren't, they said, "Oh no, no, um, everything's going to happen." And I said, "Nah, I think you're going to get a new president." Sure enough, it comes Sisi, and they said, "Well, they don't like Sisi." I said, "Well, a lot of people don't like their leaders either, but how are you going to get him out of there?" And they said, "We can't because he's supported by the military." So at least it gives you a perspective to think about. All right, I'm almost finished this here, but good questions, Devin. I wish I could tell you more. I'm sure they're there within those countries. They're in the schools, just like we have third and fourth graders who are going to produce wonderful things for us. It's just they got to get through the system so they can do those things. They're there. They've always been there, but sometimes they're not heard like that, and they want things. They want to write and publish things in newspapers, but what's reported is only one aspect of what life is like there, and sometimes we don't get all of it. But this is what I can tell you, at least now, that people don't have them. They want them. It's not that the regime wants to deny them that, is that they don't have the resources to do that. If you look at a map, you'll see the great diversity of the Sassanids, of the great Persian Empire, of the people that are there. It's a blending of a lot of different people, and they have beliefs and ideas. And once you try to unify them, we covered that when I talked about the Qajars and what was going on and how that was, Twifigs and all of these from Egypt, Iraq to Iran. You can see these key people that are there. All right. So the revolution was for the downtrodden and those left behind. Most revolutions are today. But then when you get in, are you able to deal with it? Just like, well, the French Revolution was for all the poor urban people and destitute in Paris. Well, yes and no. That's a different kind of revolution as to what's happening there. And so what happens here is that when the Shah was trying to do that, a lot of those reforms in Iran under the Shah, like Western reforms, start at the top and work their way down until you finally get to the group of people that's the largest that are ready to get these. And so these sweeping reforms were trying to get through Parliament. What happened? Parliament was slowing them up because, that's all politics. And if it was more under the Ottoman system, they would have. But see, Iran is not Ottoman. They weren't part of the Ottoman Empire. They were on their own. They're Safavids. So they have this idea of monarchy. So the monarch has got to make the decisions. Monarch can't make the decisions because all of them, because there's a parliament. You got checks and balances to it. And so probably some were dragging their feet until they got what they wanted from the Shah or from some foreign resources that came in. And in the interim, it's like, okay, the monarchy's leaving. Just as it came in their history, so it then ends. Um, and then what happens is, how are we going to deal with those that are left behind? So if we look at it today a little bit, 25 to 30 million people are below the poverty line. So what you need to do is look at how many people are in Illinois, Ohio, and Indiana, and you can get an idea of how many people uh, are in a very difficult situation. And it's probably worse now in the last couple of years because of all this ramping up, trying to build nuclear weapons and the sanctions that are there, and for them to get their oil out, and providing weapons and back and forth. What's China doing? What's Russia doing? All of that. Iran over the years has been exploited by the Russians, and we've gone into that, and they know that as well. And so we'll just have to see how that plays out. But what happens then is there's another 50 to 70 million people close to poverty. So if you take the high line here, let's take 30 here, and let's take 70 there. You've got about 100 million people that are close to poverty. Okay, there's that many people there. Well, look at how many people we have. And so these are the best numbers we have. And I can't tell you exactly because I haven't seen a recent census, and I'm not sure if the recent census coming out of Iran is reported correctly or not. And so we have an idea that we can say, uh, with some pretty good evidence, that there's a large number of people currently in what was known as Persia, uh, in Iran, not the Iran that goes further north that the Russia has taken over those areas. They're living in some pretty poverty situations, and by and large, they don't like it. Nobody likes it, and it's like we need to make some change. The word is called reform. Changes, modernization is what we're looking for. Greater modernization. So the conflict again today is between change and no change, between conservatives and moderates, between progress and the status quo. Okay, 14% of the entire population lives in tents. Okay, that ought to tell you a little something. Okay, so just take the numbers I gave you, take 14% of that, and they live in tents. So usually when I went over this in the past, and said, "Well, gee, that's terrible." I said, "Well, let's wait a minute here. Let's look at their culture. What's wrong with that, especially in the climate, their whole history? That's how they live. Well, they shouldn't be living in tents. Well, do you want to go over there and tell them that? Do you like living in your house? Right. If somebody comes over and say you shouldn't be living in this house, you should be living in a tent in the park. You'll say, "Well, I don't want to live in a tent in the park." Right. They're beautiful. It's just, see, you can't judge them. Right. So part of it, if you're living in a tent, you're probably grouped in the area of poverty. That's why I don't like those numbers. So I put these up there, and then I have a big discussion in class about them. And then students will say, "Oh, yeah, well, then maybe that's not poverty." I said, "Well, maybe that isn't poverty. If you're going to say you're in poverty because you're living in a tent, um, may not work. So, what kind of numbers do we get from the UN here?" All right, I'm getting close here because I just got a few more. So, I just want to give you that because this is another cultural aspect. So, people that are living in these, and I'm sure they don't get newspapers, or maybe they get media like that. Nobody puts out saying, "Well, those people that are living in Iran, living in tents, shouldn't be living in tents." But generally, people would look that way because they're applying it from their perspective like that. But as they're still maybe semi-nomadic people that travel that way, we have people that travel from place to place, and they set up their trailers and things, and that's how they live and that's how they work. Nothing wrong with that. They're not poverty stricken. That's a lifestyle. Individuals that work in agriculture and things of that nature travel by caravan. Sure, they have a home base somewhere, but they travel to do things. Same thing in China. Massive movement of people to work from place to place. All right. So 33% live in substandard housing. So I already know, well, is a tent considered substandard housing? As soon as we think of a tent, we think of homeless and things like that, but there are communities like that. Well, what kind of reform? Maybe they don't want high rises. I don't know that, but see this idea of what we have here. So it gives you some perspective to take a look at. 50% of the workforce has irregular employment. Now, that means they don't work all the time. That means they work part of the time, which tells you that the work that they do could be related to agricultural or certain kinds of production where we produce these at a certain time of the year and then we don't produce them after that. So this culture here in Illinois in the dead of winter, you won't be out there picking corn in our cornfield because it's winter and corn doesn't grow. So when they're producing these tremendous watermelons, and they probably have the best watermelons in the world, uh, in the northern part, they maybe a growing season is so long so that they only do that. And so what you have to do is I'm giving you this so that you can then look through the idea of what do we mean by irregular employment. To them, they've been doing that culturally for years, and that's what they continue to do. But when they report it out, it comes out like this: 10 to 13 million, no health coverage or unemployment insurance. Okay. And when we get to the youth, which is really important, unemployment, I'll get to the standard unemployment is rated at about 25% of the Iranian population unemployed, and we think youth unemployment is about 40%. So, what are they doing if they're not working? Well, they're probably going to school. Some of them could be in religious school, could be in the mosque. We don't know, and so you get an idea that maybe they're studying, they're on internships. What is employment? What is full employment? So those numbers are different. Okay, what happened to the Iranian Revolution of 1979? Mm-hmm. Right. So we're at 1 minute after 10. So this is the question that I'll leave you with because it's still going on today. What happened to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, 1980, when Reagan's administration comes in, the hostages are released? What happens to Iran uh, in the last 41 years? Have they been able to move forward with their um, situation? Now, when we've had disasters and things like that, the United States and different UNESCO organizations, and they've had earthquakes and all kinds of things like that, have provided resources and help for them. Um, so the question is, what does the future hold? Not only for Iran, but for the Middle East as the struggles still continue. So we hope for a much better Middle East, and we hope for what everybody has wanted for a long period of time: order and stability, peace, harmony, everything that all of us wish for every day uh, in our own communities, our own country, in the world. And those are important things to people. And so there's hope. Um, it's the center of civilization, starts in the Tigris Euphrates, and they've been there a long time, and they're smart enough to figure it out. Just may take a little longer and less interference from the outside. That's kind of my perspective. All right, that's all that we can do for today. I've got to get ready for the next class. Thank you all.